Welcome to Unit 9. We're going to finish up with globalization, essentially hitting the 20th century. All right, so in the 20th century, we start with writing letters and end with writing texts. In that transition, we sent out information through phones, radios, television sets, computers, cell phones that become computers, all while keeping televisions that become larger, then thinner. And we get rid of landline telephones, and our computers no longer take up buildings or rooms. And now we can fit on our laps, should we decide to have a laptop when our cell phones can now do most of the work of a laptop. We can transmit information so quickly, get it from one person to another across a room or even across a globe, all in the span of 100 years. That's not the only thing that's changed, of course. We can generate power in new ways, such as nuclear power. It is a cleaner source of energy, but it can come with dangers, such as Chernobyl, that incident in 1986, Three Mile Island in 1979, or even Fukushima in 2011. Nuclear power works by the use of nuclear reactions that release nuclear energy to generate heat, which is then most frequently used in steam turbines to produce electricity in a nuclear power plant. Of course, even when there aren't issues with what can go wrong, there is the issue with nuclear waste. Some low level waste can be stored at the plant until it stops being radioactive and is safe to be disposed of like normal trash. Otherwise, low level waste is collected and transported safely to one of four disposal facilities in South Carolina, Washington, Utah, or Texas. But if a city isn't going to use nuclear. There's coal, which is dangerous to the workers and is dirty for the environment. And there's oil, which means digging in the earth, and that can be dangerous to workers and the environment. So there's a lot of lose lose situations. So we are trying to use new ways to get our energy. Other things that happened during this time are the Green Revolution, which think of it like the Champerice of our time. This is also known as the Third Agricultural Revolution. This happens during the 1950s and 60s. Basically, we got high yielding varieties of cereals, especially dwarf wheat and rice, by using chemical fertilizers, agrochemicals, and controlled water supply, essentially using irrigation and newer methods of cultivation, including mechanization. One key leader was Norman Borlaug. He's known as the father of the Green Revolution, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. Unfortunately, this whole revolution ended up affecting both agricultural biodiversity, also known as agrodiversity, or wild biodiversity. Essentially, we're only farming the same kind of wheat all the time. And on top of that, wheat, rice, and soybean crops, the ones that were a part of this revolution, account for a significant amount of the increase in carbon in the atmosphere over the last 50 years. To hurt the movement even more, agricultural machinery and transport, as well as the production of pesticides and nitrates, all depend on fossil fuels. Lastly, the consumption of the pesticides used to kill pests by humans in some cases may be increasing the likelihood of cancer in some of the rural villages using them. So the Green Revolution was a real plus because it actually helped feed loads and loads of people. And then all of a sudden, after we started to realize how great it was, we went, oh, wait, it could be killing lots of people. Birth control, vaccines, and antibiotics, we talked about in class. And I can also provide those slides for you. So let's talk about the technological advances and limitations. So, despite the progress in the 20th century, there are many areas of the world where poverty still strikes. Due to poverty, disease is still rampant. Several diseases still strike those areas, and malaria is one of them. Malaria is spread by mosquitoes, mostly around where the equator is, and is commonly associated with poverty and has a significant negative impact on economic development. Pesticides and mosquito nets do help, of course, but it's hard to get that to those areas. Tuberculosis usually affects the lungs and kills about half of those that it infects. It spreads through the air. Prevention of TB involves screening those at high risk, early detection and treatment of cases, and of course, vaccination with the BCG vaccine. Those at high risk include household, workplace, and social contacts of people with active TB. Treatment requires the use of multiple antibiotics over a long period of time. And of course, we have to worry about that antibiotic resistance, and that's a growing problem with increasing rates of multiple drug resistant tuberculosis and extensively drug resistant tuberculosis. However, getting exposed to TB is very rare in the United States, as most people have the vaccine. Cholera is an infectious and often fatal bacterial disease in the small intestine, typically contracted from infected water supplies and causing severe vomiting and diarrhea. These are three diseases that are still around, but often hit in smaller villages in countries that do not have access to to clean drinking water. I apologize, or sanitation or vaccines at no fault of their own. The 20th century also saw the rise of new epidemics. We've discussed the 1918 flu epidemic, erroneously called the Spanish flu, which was only called that due to the fact that Spain, not involved in World War I, actually reported their deaths due to the flu. We are currently living through COVID, so we know about this epidemic. Ebola, hemorrhagic, if I can properly pronounce that, fever of humans and other primates, was first identified in 1976 and since then has had 24 outbreaks. It has reached the States twice, recently in the last 20 years, and once in 1989 in Virginia, but it is predominantly located in Africa. And then there is HIV/AIDS, which is believed to have been around for most of the 20th century, but only started to affect the world in a huge way in the late 70s and the early 80s, when people did not know what was killing the gay male community, which is the community that was being most affected at the time. It killed quickly until the 90s when the triple cocktail came out. And now people who are infected can often live a very long life, often until their 90s, often with very low viral loads. Also, it is not the virus that causes their death, but the virus weakens their immune system. And it is something else that attacks their immune system, like pneumonia, that will cause that person's death. And no, you do not have to be gay to catch it. It can take anyone. So you have to be careful. Speaking of long lives, as we are living longer, we are developing new diseases that doctors are working to help us live with or fight. That includes heart disease, as our hearts were probably not designed to live and pump this long, and Alzheimer's. Heart disease causes 1 in 4 deaths and is the leading cause of death in the United States. And a contributing factor is a poor diet, but it can also be genetics. Alzheimer's is a progressive disease that destroys memory and other important functions. Unfortunately, there is no cure for Alzheimer's, but medications and management strategies may temporarily improve symptoms. So we also have to talk about technological advances and the debates about the environment after 1900. So not only are humans having to deal with the body changing, but the earth is also having to deal with these changes. Humans are needing space and materials, so they start destroying forests to take the space and use the wood, which leads to deforestation, which is this picture right up here on the top left. We also resort to desertification or desertification. I'm trying to figure out how to say that word. The process by which fertile land becomes desert, typically as a result of drought, deforestation, or inappropriate agriculture. Right here, we have the Dominican Republic on the bottom right, and Haiti. That island is split into two countries. And this line right here is a portion where right here we have the Dominican Republic, and right here you have Haiti, because they deforest on one side and they didn't on the other. On the top right, you have the hole in the ozone layer that actually just recently closed up in December of 2020. So this no longer exists, but essentially we had really did a number on our ozone by tearing a hole in it with the release of greenhouse gases. And I know a lot of you saw these pictures when COVID, when we were all locked up, when we stayed inside. We weren't releasing as much smog into our atmosphere. And this is a picture of the city where you have smog on the right and no smog on the left. So when we were all staying indoors, we weren't going out and driving our cars as much. Our smog numbers went down. So just, people tend to destroy the environment just by driving around sometimes. We don't realize it. Okay, let's jump into economic policies, the economics in the last 20th century. So, right up here on the top left, we've got Ronald Reagan from the 1980s. The free market policies under Reagan were nicknamed Reaganomics. He had four pillars that his economic policies were to reduce the growth of government spending, reduce the federal income tax and capital gains tax, reduce government regulations, and tighten the money supply in order to reduce inflation. His opponents had some nicknames for it. They called it supply side economics, trickle down economics, or voodoo economics. On the plus side, after he was done being president, there was a boost of entrepreneurship. Rich people did get richer and the middle class did do well. And unemployment was basically the same. Like there was a big dip. There were more unemployed people for a while, but then it went back to normal when he was done. On the bad side, though, poor people did not do well under him. The national debt did triple, and there was a widening gap between the rich and the poor. So there are pluses and there are negatives. All right, down on the bottom right, we have Margaret Thatcher from England. What she wanted, it was called Thatcherism. She wanted the privatization of state-owned assets. She wanted a big thing for her was deregulation of the financial industry. She wanted to reduce the power of trade unions and a reduction in income tax. See, since World War II, England had essentially been a welfare state, and she wanted to reject that completely. However, not the National Health Service. She wanted to keep that because it was so popular with the people. She is credited with reviving Britain's economy, but they say it was at the expense of the people. Many children were left under the poverty line, around 30% in, I think it was 1994, after she left power. Up in the top right, we have a gentleman named Deng Xiaoping from China. Oops, sorry. He started the program of economic reforms termed socialism with Chinese characteristics, also known as socialist market economy in the People's Republic of China. The reforms went into stagnation after the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, but were revived after his southern tour in 1992. And in 2010, China overtook Japan as the world's second largest economy. The first stage of this whole thing in the late 70s and early 80s involved the decollectivization of agriculture, the opening up of the country to foreign investment, and the permission for entrepreneurs to start businesses. However, a large percentage of industries remained state controlled. The second stage of reform in the late 80s and 90s involved the privatization and contracting out of much state owned industry. The 1985 lifting of price controls was a major reform, and protectionist policies and regulations soon followed, although state monopolies in sectors such as banking and petroleum remained. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. We'll talk about them a bit later. The private sector grew remarkably, accounting for as much as 70% of China's gross domestic product by 2005. And then from 78 until 2013, unprecedented growth occurred with the economy increasing by 9.5% a year. Hopefully, you guys are starting to see kind of a trend happening, this idea of opening up the country and just getting more trade to come in. Then we have Pinochet down here. There was a confidential economic plan known as El Iadrillo, literally meaning the brick, so called because the report was as thick as a brick. The plan had been quietly prepared in May of 1973 by economists who opposed Salvador Allende's government. With the help of by a group of economists, the press were calling the Chicago Boys because they were predominantly alumni of the University of Chicago. This document contained the backbone of what would later on become the Chilean economic policy. So remember, Pinochet takes over after the Allende government in that coup. So according to the 1975 report of a U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee investigation, the Chilean economic plan was prepared in collaboration with the CIA. The plan recommended a set of economic reforms that included deregulation and privatization. Among other reforms, they made the central bank independent, cut tariffs, privatized the state controlled pension system, state industries and banks, and reduce taxes. Pinochet's stated aim was to, quote, make Chile not a nation of proletarians, but a nation of entrepreneurs. So the first reforms were implemented in three rounds: 1974 to 1983, 1985, and 1990. So the government welcomed foreign investment and eliminated protectionist trade barriers, forcing Chilean businesses to compete with imports on equal footing, or else you were going to go out of business. Starting in 1985, with Herman Bucci as Minister of Finance, the focus of economic policy shifted towards financial solvency and economic growth. Exports grew rapidly and unemployment went down, but poverty was still a big issue. So in 1990, the newly elected Patricia Aylwin government undertook a program of growth with equity, emphasizing both continued economic liberalization and poverty reduction. Between 1990 and 2000, poverty was reduced from 40% of the population to 20%. They halved their poverty. 60% of this reduction can be attributed to GDP growth, with the remaining 40% attributable to social policies. Kind of a big deal. Now, we've got other types of economies during this time. We have one known as a knowledge economy. A knowledge economy is a system of consumption and production that is based on intellectual capital. In particular, it refers to the ability to capitalize on scientific discoveries and basic and applied research. So, Finland, their economic situation in the early 1990s was bad. The country went through a severe economic recession characterized by a major banking crisis, unemployment rates that rose from 5% to over 15%, and the accumulation of government debt from modest levels to over 60% of GDP that were approaching international lending limits. Essentially, they couldn't get money from anyone. But in recent years, it has been consistently ranked among the top performers in international competitiveness rankings, and measured by many indicators related to the knowledge economy, it has been ranked first. They're essentially really big on telecommunications and other technology. That's how they got ahead. Japan, after World War II, they weren't allowed by any other world powers to concentrate on having a military. They got a little power hungry, as they did after the 1800s and then the 1900s. They got a little crazy. So they concentrated on innovation instead, and that included technology, and they took off. They were huge when it came to power. So that's why they were a knowledge economy. And the US, for a very long time, was ahead of the curve for technology as well. And you could still make a strong argument that it is. But for education, you could now say that European and Scandinavian countries are pulling ahead, at least when it comes to primary and secondary education. Our colleges are still ranked pretty high. And you could say Asian countries are pulling ahead as far as technology is going. Now you've got like Vietnam and Bangladesh, where their economies are more reliant on production and manufacturing. Vietnam, for example, their manufacturing sector accounted for 16.48% of their country's total GDP in 2019, reaching a value of 995.13 trillion Vietnamese dong. Now, Latin American production and manufacturing economies, we look at Mexico. Mexico is the 12th largest exporter in the world. Mexico is also South America's largest automotive manufacturer. Honduras is a little bit more interesting because they say that their agriculture is more their biggest thing, especially coffee is one of their biggest exporters. But agriculture is 14% of their GDP. Manufacturing is 15%. It's mostly textile exports, although they also have an assembly industry that is primarily owned by Asian firms, with 21 South Korean owned companies and export processing zones located in the Rio Silla Valley in 1991. All right, let's talk about some more economics in the global age. Let's talk about the economic institutions and regional trade agreements. We need to know what the WTO is. It's the World Trade Organization. It is an intergovernmental organization that regulates and facilitates international trade between nations. Now, remember, up until this time, countries have been making their own trade deals. They still do, but the World Trade Organization is kind of like a parent that stands in between the two nations and says, okay, let me look over your deal here and make sure it's all good. It officially commenced operations on January 1st, 1995. The WTO is the world's largest international economic organization with 164 member states representing over 96% of global trade and global GDP. Now, there are more countries than 164, but out of 164, they're the ones that they're like looking over them. The WTO facilitates trade in goods, services, and intellectual property among participating countries by providing a framework for negotiating trade agreements. So they kind of lay out and say, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. These trade agreements, the framework, it usually aims to reduce or eliminate tariffs, quotas, and other restrictions. These agreements are signed by representatives of member governments and ratified by their legislatures. So these frameworks are agreed upon by the 164 member states. The WTO also administers independent dispute resolutions for enforcing participants' adherence to trade agreements and resolving trade related disputes. So let's say America signs a trade agreement with China and America goes back on their word. China can go to the WTO and say, hey, wait a minute, America said they were going to do this, and then they went and did that. So the WTO steps in and says, okay, before you guys start fighting, let's look over the agreement and make sure we can find what went wrong. The organization prohibits discrimination between trading partners, but provides exceptions for environmental protection, national security, and other important goals. Then we have NAFTA. This is the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is a treaty entered into by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It went into effect on January 1st, 1994. Free trade had existed between the US and Canada since 1989, but of course, NAFTA broadened that arrangement. And then we have the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This is an economic union comprising of 10 member states in Southeast Asia, which promotes intergovernmental cooperation and facilitates economic, political, security, military, educational, and socio-cultural integration among its members and other countries in Asia. So you kind of have these little pocket organizations underneath the World Trade Organization where they make their own deals amongst each other. So the ASEAN is going to make deals with other countries within Southeast Asia. And then NAFTA is going to work within the three countries there instead of all of us coming together. Because if the US and Canada can work together on something and not have to get the WTO involved, that's just what they're going to do. And then we're going to also talk briefly about multinational corporations. What is a multinational corporation? Well, let me tell you. It's usually a large corporation incorporated in one country which produces or sells goods or services in various countries. Two common characteristics shared by MNCs are their large size and the fact that their worldwide activities are centrally controlled by the parent companies. So think of it like McDonald's, Google, Twitter, Facebook. All right. So here are some you may not have thought about as a multinational corporation. Nestle, like Nestle Toll House cookies. All right. Nestle is a Swiss multinational food and drink processing conglomerate corporation headquartered in Switzerland. To be exact, it's in Vevey, Switzerland. It's the largest food company in the world, measured by revenue and other metrics since 2014. Nestle's products include baby food, medical food, bottled water, breakfast cereals, coffee and tea, confectionery, dairy products, ice cream, frozen food, pet foods, and snacks. 29 of Nestle's brands have annual sales of over 1.1 US billion dollars. Nestle has 447 factories, operates in 189 countries, and employs around 339,000 people. It is one of the main shareholders of L'Oreal, the world's largest cosmetic companies. The Nissan Motor Company. Let's talk about them. That is a Japanese multinational automobile manufacturer headquartered in Yokohama, Japan. The company sells its vehicles under the Nissan, Infiniti, and Datsun brands. Nissan is the leading Japanese brand in China, Russia, and Mexico. 2014, Nissan was the largest car manufacturer in North America. As of April 2018, Nissan was the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer with global sales of more than 320,000 all electric vehicles. Mahindra and Mahindra Limited is an Indian multinational automotive manufacturing corporation headquartered in Mumbai, India. It was established in 1945 as Muhammad and Mahindra and later renamed as Mahindra and Mahindra. It is one of the largest vehicle manufacturers by production in India and the largest manufacturer of tractors in the world. All right, we're going to step away from economics. We're going to go to calls for reform and response. Again, we're talking about everything that's happening. It's globalization. All right, so people start to challenge the preconceived ideas that had once been held by those in power. And of course, we know in the 20th century doesn't stop. Those that are in power then are still in power today. But United Nations starts to try to protect the rights of children, women, and refugees after all the genocides that have been taking place. We start to have global feminist movements, which do start a lot in the Western societies, Western countries, and then tend to force Western ideas on other countries. So it's in recent years that the feminist movements have had to start to rework themselves to remember that it should remain educated and not just keep white women in power, but rather listen to women of color and all for all voices to move this movement forward. So they have been trying to re-educate themselves in recent years. Not to say women of color haven't been in these movements, they just haven't had as big a voice. Then we have the Negritude movement, which is a literary movement of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s that began among French-speaking African and Caribbean writers living in Paris as a protest against French colonial rule and the policy of assimilation. The Harlem Renaissance inspired this movement, and it responded to the alienated position of Black people in history. The movement asserted an identity for Black people around the world that was their own. For some of these poets, Amy Cesari and Leon Damas, the rupture from Africa through the Atlantic slave trade was a great part of their cultural understanding. Their work told of the frustration and loss of their motherland. For Senegalese poet Leopold Sedar Senghor, his works focus more on African traditionalism. In ways, the assertion of each poet diverges from each other, but the combination of different perspectives is also what fueled and fed this movement. Then we have the liberation theology movement. This was a religious movement arising in the late 20th century in Roman Catholicism and centered in Latin America. It sought to apply religious faith by aiding the poor and oppressed through involvement in political and civic affairs. It is a synthesis, that's the joining of two things, of Christian theology and socioeconomic analyses that emphasizes the quote, social concern for the poor and political liberation for oppressed peoples, end quote. It emphasizes evangelism and social responsibility. Now, Pope Francis has recently commented about how he is welcome to this idea, even if the Catholic Church had been sort of closed off to it for many years. Other changes are, of course, the fact that the doors are opening for women. Women get the right to vote in many countries. In the US, it's 1920. In Brazil, the right to vote comes to women in 1923. Turkey, 1934. Japan, 1945. India, 1947. Morocco, 1963, just to name a few countries. And not only could women vote, but they could also hold office. Women were getting access to education and higher education. Women were starting to get into college. In the US, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1965. So even though African Americans were given the right to vote with the passing, let's see, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, the 14th Amendment made African Americans citizens, and the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Well, it wasn't until 1965 that outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted by many in the southern states after the Civil War, including literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting. But then you have the apartheid system in South Africa. That was ended through a series of negotiations between 1990 and it wasn't until 1994 that it was finally officially done through these steps, these unilateral steps the country had to go through. And then we have India with its caste system. They're trying to reform it. They start a caste reservation system. Reservation is a system of affirmative action in India that provides historically disadvantaged groups representation in education, employment, and politics. Based on provisions in the Indian constitution, it allows the Indian government to set reserved quotas or seats, which lower the qualifications needed in exams, job openings, and etc. for socially and economically, quote, backward citizens, end quote. Reservation was intended to uplift these communities, but the government's failure to control the amount of reservation and lack of comprehensive review of the policies by the government had resulted in wide criticism and backlash. It is often described as a menace primarily due to its anti-meritocratic nature, which is causing further division and discrimination in society. We also have these calls for reform within our environmental movements. So we have a group known as Greenpeace. Greenpeace is a non governmental environmental organization with offices in over 55 countries and an international coordinating body in Amsterdam, which is located in the Netherlands. Greenpeace was founded in 1971 by Irving Stowe and Dorothy Stowe, Canadian and U.S. expat environmental activists. They use nonviolent creative action to pave the way towards a greener, more peaceful world and to confront the systems that threaten our environment. They have received criticism by going against GMOs, but also have to point out governments like the United States government have tried to smear them and have done so unsuccessfully when it was found out that the evidence used against them was false. I also want to talk about the Green Belt movement, which was founded by Professor Wangari Maathai in 1977 under the auspices of the National Council of Women of Kenya to respond to the needs of rural Kenyan women who reported that their streams were drying up, their food supply was less secure, and they had to walk further and further to get firewood for fuel and fencing. So the Greenbelt movement encouraged the women to work together to grow seedlings and plant trees, to bind the soil, store rainwater, and provide food and firewood and receive a small monetary token for their work. Shortly after beginning this work, Professor Mathai saw that behind the everyday hardships of the poor, environmental degradation, deforestation, and food insecurity were deeper issues of disempowerment, disenfranchisement, and the loss of traditional values that had previously empowered communities to protect their environment. That if they work together for mutual benefit and to do so selflessly and honestly, essentially, if everything's working against you, you're going to feel disempowered and you're going to start to give up. Since Wangari Maathai started the movement in 1977, over 51 million trees have been planted, and over 30,000 women have been trained in forestry, food processing, beekeeping, and other trades that help them earn income while preserving their lands and resources. Communities in Kenya, both men and women, have been motivated and organized to both prevent further environmental destruction and restore that which has been damaged. I believe the professor also got a Nobel Prize in 2004 for his work. Now let's talk about the World Fair Trade Organization instead of the World Trade Organization. The World Fair Trade Organization is a global association of 401 organizations who are committed to improving the livelihoods of economically marginalized producers. The WFTO has members in 76 countries. Members are primarily fair trade enterprises whose business model is verified by independent audit and peer review. Their big thing is creating opportunities for economically disadvantaged producers. So they wouldn't want to partner with a multinational company that wouldn't work with small producers who are unable to get a piece of the market. All right, so globalized culture after 1900. We know that culture is going to change. We've got new types of music like reggae. We've got the new type of movie industry, Bollywood, social media. You guys don't even use Facebook that much. Twitter, you might be using. I put TikTok there in the background. Television, you got the British Broadcasting Company. Sports, we've got World Cup soccer and the Olympics. That, of course, with television now, everyone can watch it. Global consumerism, not just Amazon, but and not just eBay, but you've got Alibaba, which is a Chinese multinational technology company specializing in e-commerce, retail, internet, and technology. And of course, we've got global brands like Toyota, Coca-Cola, you've got Apple, all sorts of this globalized culture. But we're also going to have resistance to globalization. Just because it seems like a good thing, it can also hurt people. So, the anti globalization movement, also known as the counter globalization movement, is a social movement critical of economic globalization. The movement is also commonly referred to as the global justice movement, alter globalization movement, anti-globalist movement, anti-corporate globalization movement, or movement against neoliberal globalization. You don't have to know all that. It's just if you hear it at some point, then you'll know what it's talking about. What is shared is that the participants oppose large multinational corporations having unregulated political power exercised through trade agreements and deregulated financial markets. Many anti globalization activists do not oppose globalization in general. And what they do, though, is they call for forms of global integration that better provide democratic representation. They call for advancement of human rights, fair trade, and sustainable development, and therefore feel the term anti globalization is misleading. So they're not essentially against it because there's some good stuff that comes from it. They just don't like the fact that it's unregulated. Now, in order to know what anti-IMF is, you need to know what the IMF is. So the IMF is the International Monetary Fund. It is an international financial institution headquartered in Washington, D.C., consisting of 190 countries working to foster global monetary cooperation, secure financial stability, facilitate international trade, promote high employment and sustainable economic growth, and reduce poverty around the world while periodically depending on the World Bank for its resources. Okay. Unfortunately, its downside. Developed countries were seen to have a more dominant role and control over less developed countries. Some International Monetary Fund policies may be anti developmental. And in 2006, a senior action aid policy analyst, Akanksha Marfatia, stated that IMF policies in Africa undermine any possibility of meeting the Millennial Developmental Goals due to imposed restrictions that prevent spending on important sectors such as education and health. Essentially, Africa is going to be left behind. And then former chief economist of IMF and former Reserve Bank of India, Governor Raghuram Rajan, who predicted the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, so this guy knows what he's talking about, criticized the IMF for remaining a sideline player to the developed world. He criticized the IMF for praising the monetary policies of the US, which he believed were wreaking havoc in emerging markets. Now, what's the World Bank? The World Bank is an international financial institution that provides loans and grants to the governments of low and middle income countries for the purpose of pursuing capital projects. So if you're a country that is developing, you've just been gotten rid of your colonizing government, and the World Bank's like, hey, we're going to give you a grant. You don't have to pay us back. We're going to help you pursue a capital project. Awesome. What's the bad side about the World Bank? One of the most common criticisms to the World Bank has been the way it was governed. While the World Bank represents 188 countries, it is run by a small number of economically powerful countries. Another source of criticism has been the tradition of having an American head the bank. Only Americans head the bank. Implemented because the US provides the majority of World Bank funding. That's why. So, another thing, resistance to globalization. In China, you can't have access to Twitter, of course, unless you have a workaround. But they don't need Twitter. They have their own version. They have Weibo in China. So they find that some countries find their own ways to go around globalization. They just create their own stuff. So something else, something we have talked about, the United Nations, of course, that came about after World War II as a way to prevent huge wars because, of course, the League of Nations did not work. So you'll want to know about the United Nations. We've talked about it several times. Lastly, your Unit 9 review. These are the big picture ideas. You want to be able to explain the extent to which science and technology brought change in the period from 1900 to the present, and explain how and why globalization changed international interactions among the states. And obviously, I spent a lot of time on economics. I'm pretty sure I pronounced many words incorrectly, but I hope you learned a lot. I hope I cut down Unit 9 for you guys. Make sure you do your readings, and that's all I got for you. All right, have a great day. Goodbye.